Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Sarah Colado of Architecture Talk Time. Today, I have Anthony Robledo with me from Architosh, who basically runs a magazine and a publication platform, Architosh, that is dedicated to design technology and BIM. And being on top of these topics with everything that is happening currently in the industry from a technological perspective, I thought we're going to have a conversation with Anthony dedicated to really what's new in CAD and BIM and a little bit discussing the different trends and as well just deep diving into Anthony's passions. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, well, thank you, Sarah, for the invite. This was a lovely surprise.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about the publication platform.
Sure. So let me start with myself. I'm a licensed architect in the United States, practicing in Boston. I've been actually practicing. Next year will be my 40th year of being in an office, a firm. I started quite early. I actually started working in a firm when I was 18 in high school. I was kind of like just what we call the gopher. I'd go for this, go for that, and I did a lot of various tasks, from running blueprints to even a little bit of picking up red marks on drafting. And I started my career actually in a kind of unconventional way, in the sense that I had this drafting background, and I went directly from high school to a technology program that trains you to be an architectural draftsman. And then after I completed that program, I instantly found employment in an architecture firm. And then I wanted to be more, and I wanted to get involved with the full spectrum of practice. So I went to college and then to architecture school. And that took me from Santa Barbara, California to Boston. And I've been here ever since. But I think an important point in telling you this little story is that while I'm interested in all aspects of practice, I have a very long history with the production side of practice, right? Because I first thought I just wanted to be, an architectural draftsman and make blueprints, and I thought I would find all the joy in the world in doing that. What I learned in that process, however, and I did put in a full decade, a little bit more than a decade plus, in various firms that were not digitized yet, is I gained this decade of understanding how production happened when we were all on, paper and pencil.
Mm-hmm.
And I have that to compare as a kind of baseline to where we are today, where we've been with digital technology. And I have to say that my love affair with computing kind of came late. I was actually really all the way through architecture school before I realized that I was sort of in love with the computing aspect of the industry. And that led me in 1999 to create Architosh. And the publication has been around that long. And initially, we focused on just the Macintosh side of the industry. I was working for Coder Kim in Boston. Fred Coder was the dean at Yale at the time, and we were a Mac firm. And he'd come back from Yale and say, this is like 1997, 98, and say, all the kids are saying that the Apple's going to die and that we're going to have to move to Windows. And of course, the firm at that time had a very high level of expertise on the Mac platform and the tools that we were using on the Mac platform. And so someone in the firm gave me this idea that I should create a website that was focused on helping firms like ours stay on the platform by recognizing that there are many tools out there. It wasn't as dire as people made it out to be. And so I decided to do that because there was people in the firm that were interested in building websites. And in the late 90s, everyone was talking about the web. So I thought, being a kind of techie now, I'll learn those skills too. And so I made Architosh really as just to have a subject to practice on to build a website. But it instantly became very popular, and it changed my thinking about what I might do going forward.
I love this. So you often say that you focus your newsletters and Architosh on the economics of technology in architecture and the AEC. altogether. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about economics and that side of technology, because of course this podcast is dedicated to business. Also, we're always interested to deep dive into the topics of economy within our industry. I think that knowing about it first and foremost, but also knowing how to properly tap into it as designers and especially people within technology can help our businesses. So tell me a little bit more about that relationship.
Yeah, so I think what's been happening with the publication over the last, I don't know, I think it's been 8 years that we've been going to the AIA show, the big convention for architects in the United States. And Pete Evans, a senior associate editor, and myself would go typically, and we would visit all the booths, all the technology booths, and we would do what we'd call the Best of Show awards. And from year to year, what we would do is not just bring some limelight to what the best technologies we saw at the AIA convention, but we would write a little bit of a paper on where we thought these technologies were headed and why. That led us to think about sort of the nature of practice and what practice actually wants to be like for the typical architect. People go into architecture school with certain assumptions that may not prove to be true. I know I did, and most of my friends who are architects also had that happen to them. And so this led us to think about sort of how are the tools impacting the more enjoyable aspects of practice. Most architects go into design fields because they want to be designers, but very few of us get to be designers actually. But we're all designers in architecture school. You know, everyone is the design principal in architecture school. So in a nutshell, what we've been doing over the years is writing more and more about this reality and practice, and in particular trying to democratize not only design, but democratize the time for design, and thinking about how digital technologies should be saving us the time to have more what we call contemplative space to be creatives in the field. Because we both agree that the field's core value is in its creativity, and we believe that the underlying purpose of all these digital tools should be to free up that capacity. And that's sort of an umbrella framework or philosophy for how we've been thinking about digital tools and writing about them. In the last few years, due to the open Revit letter discussions, we've been a part of that. Martin Day at AC Magazine, who's a good friend, had brought me into the fold in some of those discussions with the firms that were involved in that. And that set up a whole other wave of sort of dialogues and articles that touched more on economics.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about this actually, because it's been quite a movement that has been certainly getting a lot of traction and conversation about it, like within the industry. So let's speak a little bit to that.
Sure. So we've written several articles, feature articles on the Revit open letter. We were the only publication actually in the first instance, the first letter that was in 2020, that Autodesk actually chose to speak to. We spoke to the CEO and did an interview on that and focused on sort of what their response was to the Revit open letter. But in a nutshell, for people who are not aware, the Revit open letter is a letter that was written by a group of architects initially out of Great Britain, focused on their complaints or criticisms about really the development pace of Revit in conjunction with the rising cost of Revit on a license basis. The group was organized primarily around larger firms in the London area or Australia, English language, but particularly British initially. That's expanded, of course, around the world. And now the second open letter, which came this last year in the summer, actually late summer, early fall was called the Nordic open letter, because it escalated up to a different level where the Scandinavian firms now wanted to pin their own letter, and they did so sort of using their professional organizations as sort of an organizing mechanism. So that both of these open letters have been written about on the platform, Architosh it is. And the last one that we wrote was called the Revit Open Letter Through the Lens of Coordinomics. And I didn't want to write another paper about just all the complaints. What I wanted to do was focus an article on the dynamics of software adoption in the AEC industry, and how that the economics of this adoption are more complex than people imagine. So one of the things that came out of this particular article was that I used the story of the keyboard, the QWERTY keyboard, as a sort of a metaphor or framework for thinking about how we adopt technology. And sometimes there is actually market failure in terms of what we adopt. We can all think about things like VHS versus Betamax. Betamax had the better picture quality than VHS tapes, but there were slightly more available movies on VHS. And so back in the days when we would go to these places like Blockbuster and rent movies, what happened is that platform, even though it was technically inferior at the picture level, went out because there was another aspect to it that really mattered, this positive externality to the technology, which was the availability of movies. In the same way, when the Mac was battling the Windows in the 90s, there was more software available to the PC, and that positive externality led people to steer their way towards the PC over the Macintosh. And so once you get this sort of snowball effect, it tends to compound. And this story that's in the Revit Open Letter Through the Lens of Coordinomics is about the story of the keyboard that we all know and type on today, and how initially when typewriters came around, there were different keyboard layouts. But what happened was a school opened up around the QWERTY keyboard, and suddenly there was this availability of typists who knew how to type on this particular keyboard layout, the QWERTY layout. And as a result, that was sort of the first kind of technical interrelatedness between this new technology, the typewriter, and this other resource that mattered, trained typist. And that plays out in software today, and it plays out in industry today. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of the people in the Revit Open Letter have stayed on Revit, is because they say the availability of Revit trained people is just much higher than non-Revit trained people on alternative platforms. And so that positive network effect or positive externality is part of what's known as the expected present value of a system. Let me just define what that means. So this comes straight out of economist Paul A. David's 1984 paper, which was titled Clio and the Economics of QWERTY. And it's an excellent read. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in any of this focus matter to actually read that, which is in my article in the earliest first few paragraphs. There's a link. But what it means is that the expected present value of a system, whether it's a computer and software together or just software, is really equal to the core functionality value plus the positive network effects. And in the case of what was happening with the Revit Open Letter signatories, is they were now feeling like the benefits of the externalities were no longer compensating for the deficits in the core functionality of the tool. And that's because they're, as Andrew Anados will say, and to me in various articles that we've written about, they're pushing up against the limits of what Revit can do, what even BIM can do. And as a result, they're asking for things that actually only a few people are asking for. And while they may matter dramatically for them on an economic return basis, it doesn't make sense for Autodesk to necessarily do these things. So that's kind of where uh, the article goes in talking about this history of the critic keyboard, talking about that when people adopt tools, they don't just look at the core functionality, they also look at these other externalities that are positive, like an availability of people who know that system, of other people who use the system, like consultants, the sort of technical interrelatedness or interoperability. These are some of the things that matter. But at the same time, the article also looks at how what happens over time um, is that there is this aspect where the core functionality tends to plateau, especially when the externalities grow so large. One could also cite SketchUp as another example where the core functionality of SketchUp for a long time was really just flatlining. But in the midst of this flatlining, there still was this incredible large audience or makers, people who were adding all this additional functionality through plugins. Um, and the way alternatives have to compete against these leaders who don't benefit from positive network effects themselves is they have to pour more features into their core functionality that differentiate them from the leaders in the market because they don't have the reliance on these larger positive network effects, if that makes sense.
So interesting. I actually dropped the articles that you're talking about in the comments here. We're streaming this to Facebook, to YouTube, and to LinkedIn. The comments that I'm able to operate from this platform are actually appearing only on YouTube and on Facebook. So if you're actually watching us right now from those platforms, you can click into the articles. If you're on LinkedIn, I will post those articles on LinkedIn after we're finished here, because if I go into it, we'll just have a noise disruption. So just wanted to clarify on that. You do your own research into the productivity and the technical matters that accumulate to productivity. There is a specific focus on how to select the right GPU and CPU. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I wasn't thinking we were going to talk about that, but I'll just briefly mention that because I think that it's important, but I think some of the other things that I shared with you, I think I'd rather focus on. But basically, with that article, so what's happening in the industry right now is we're starting to get into a lot of real-time rendering, and that tends to be GPU bound. And this came up in the first Revit open letter as well, where people were saying, look, the issue with the rising licensing cost is pressing us twofold, because on one hand, it is rising and we're not getting the features that we're asking for. On the second hand, we're up against the challenges of how we have to pick a workstation that's optimized for Revit, which just uses the CPU and tends to be mostly single threaded, so it doesn't even use all the cores in the CPU. At the same time, more and more architects are using these new tools, these new real-time rendering tools that use multi-core on the CPU or are GPU intensive. And so that article, what that article does is it basically says, look, you need to economically optimize workstations for your staff. You need to think about what your software is actually doing at the CPU and the GPU level in terms of, does it rely on just the CPU? Does it benefit also from the GPU? Does it take advantage of multiple cores on the CPU? And then you need to look at, on a staff by staff basis, who is doing what. If someone's doing rendering all the time, if you have a dedicated person to that, then you can help, that article will help someone select the right kinds of combinations of GPUs, CPUs to optimize the workstation for what they're doing. A lot of people are now stuck in the middle where they're actually, say they're on Revit or they're on some other tool, and many CAD tools are single threaded and don't benefit from all these cores in the CPU. But they're starting to dabble into and use these very promising pieces of software that do use multiple cores. And so one way to analyze this is to kind of use the charts that are in that article that kind of have on the x-axis, it's about multiple cores and maybe the GPU, and on the y-axis, it's about just the fastest single thread performance in the CPU. And basically being able to dial in the right combinations for you so you can maximize the utility benefit of the hardware you're buying.
Thank you. I actually asked you about it because of specifically the relationship with productivity. And you do also talk about like academia studio history that develops a compulsive work culture mindset that is fundamentally allergic to the type of mindset that seeks to monitor, measure, and improve practice economics. And I wanted to talk to you about this because yesterday I interviewed Monograph's founder, we committed a lot of the conversation to actually practice economics and productivity and measuring. So I wanted to have that conversation with you as well. There's another article that you wrote on that topic, but can you share with us a little bit more on that?
Well, let me just start by saying, yeah, definitely. So, that there's been this unionization movement that's been going on for the last year and a half. Some of that has actually touched deep into academia. I think it was a story about SciArc and one about the Bartlett. Really, I don't know why it's gotten this bad where it's actually where students are feeling actually abused. But basically, the fundamental issue is this: in the academy, in architecture school, the way studio works is that students are really rewarded for output only and not productivity, and that's really unfortunate because it sets up a culture of compulsive work culture, a culture of overwork, a culture of diminishing the value of time, and unfortunately for all these firms that are unionizing or trying to unionize or responding to that, the reality is that productivity isn't something that's taught in schools. Not really. Maybe students will get an offhand comment that they spent too much time on this model and they should have focused on this, and so they came up short on something else. But generally, if you basically allow students to work all through the evening and the weekends and just burn the candle on both ends, you're not allowing students to gain an understanding of how productivity is actually measured. They're only getting that when they come up short and they're disappointed because they miscalculated maybe their end goals. But if students were taught that they had to not only taught but appraised and rewarded for some level of productivity, then maybe their classwork would be divided into hours where they can sort of go free with unlimited hours into the work, and other types of exercises that would time limit them, and then they would be appraised on sort of how they got to their ends, and look at their process, and that would include their tools and what decisions they made about those tools to get to some conclusion with their work. Productivity is always output over input, and unfortunately in the architecture industry, P seems to just be equal to O, output, and that's false. That's not the correct calculation. So yes, there's the other aspect of all of this that ties into the Revit open letter, which has to do with tools in the sense that there is a pressure in the industry, in academia, I think, for students to graduate with skills so they can get jobs. So a lot of classwork and training and recommendations are oriented in that direction so students can leave academia and be able to get jobs. But what's not being taught is knowledge and skills to help them optimize, sort of manifest economic optimization in the industry. And because that's not being taught, architecture practices really struggle on an economic level a lot. And unfortunately, right now for the young people in these newer generations, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're kicking and screaming now and making quite a fuss.
Mm-hmm. I love it. So, in that article, you speak a little bit about the natural monopoly path within the AEC. Can you tell us a little bit more about that concept?
Yeah. So the monopoly. Okay. So Right. And so that touches on what I just said. I mean, I think what happens is um, students are encouraged to use tools that their professors kind of tell them that they should maybe use. I was sitting in a crit for within the last 12 months. I was sitting in a crit for a class, and it was online on Zoom, and another fellow critic at the end of the segment said to all the students, great work, everyone. But I would just say to all you people who are doing all this design work in SketchUp, you should stop doing that, and you should do all your work in Revit, because that's what people are using. That's what we use at our firm, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't say anything at the time, but I thought that was appalling, because at the same time, 8 months, 9 months, 10 months later, I'm at Autodesk University, and they're announcing that they're going to disrupt themselves, in the future of the industry is in Autodesk Fusion. So the thing that is missing academia, I think, is it's not looking at the big picture of technology. They're not. It seems that professors can be too selfish in their recommendations. Those who have practices in particular will try to groom students perhaps to be suitable for being hired, perhaps, or whatever. And some of that is understandable, but I think it's really deserving to tell students that they should use this or that. What students should be told is they should be told to use their critical faculties to fully investigate the landscape of tools that are out there and make their own decisions. They should be told to build resilience into their capabilities by being able to use more than one of a different type of tool, so that they have more placement potential in the industry. When I was in the industry in the early 90s, mid 90s, and there was a bigger range of competitive tools in the landscape there at that time, what you could see right away is that architects that knew more than one CAD program were sort of more valuable in the market, because there was more disbursement, more diffusion of different technology solutions out there. And so you would basically be able to go around and have more options, because you had different skills. At the same time, like in the practice where I'm a principal, over the years, we found that when people come to the interview and they only know one tool, they tend to often be poor digital learners. But people who come in have learned more than one thing. Maybe they know MicroStation, Vectorworks, and AutoCAD. They tend to have greater facility in learning anything else digitally. I'm not sure if that translates to non-digital things in terms of them just being better learners, but that facility of being able to know more than one or two of the market-leading solutions, I think is really valuable.
I love this. We still have time to talk a little bit about your research into globalization and risk within the post-pandemic AEC industry. There was yet another article you wrote about this, and I find that research also really interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about that topic?
Yeah, that was a really big article that was, I think it's only been published in the newsletter. Generally, we publish our primary features first in the newsletter, and then they make their way to Architosh on the main website. So this came out of the COVID time, right? This came out of me thinking about the impacts of supply chains and their impacts across the world, but in particular AEC. And I read a book called The Butterfly Defect: How Globalization Creates Systemic Risk and What to Do About It, by Ian Godwin and Mike, I think his name's Maria Thesson or something like that. I don't pronounce it very right. Anyway, so this book was interesting because it was published in like 2012, 2014, somewhere around there. And it basically predicted how how COVID would eventually unfold, because they talk about pandemics in the book. And when I read the book, I started to take a deep dive into resilience. I took the whole course on resilience, the AIA online university, AIE University, and all of this research kind of manifested in this article. And I think what it comes down to is there are two opposing forces that are working against each other when it comes to resilience and what happened during pandemic. And one is lean business and lean manufacturing, and the other is planning for resilience and redundancy and having multiple ways of achieving an end, so that if something goes down, you can still achieve your end. So what I want to mention now, I think, because the article is quite large, and it talks about many things, but one of the things that comes up in the article is this notion of adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is a little different than the way resilience tends to be thought of. Adaptive capacity was defined by this scientist called Holling in 1973 as this kind of the amount of disturbance that a system can withstand before it shifts into this alternative stable state. And I love that term, alternative stable state, because wouldn't you say that we're all in that now, right? Wouldn't you say that that's how we work now, in this alternative stable state, this kind of combination of remote work and in-office work? And that's a sign of just how disruptive the pandemic has been. But the article also mentions something about how lean manufacturing has set up the world for failure in times of shock events like the pandemic, and what we can maybe do about it in the future. One of the things I learned not that long ago when interviewing a firm that was doing a project in Providence was that offsite construction, industrialized construction, which has often been heralded as a thing that is good for resilience, actually had negative aspects for shock events. What happened was this firm was working on what would be Providence's first industrialized constructed building. And the company that was building this modular building ran into a supply chain issue. They needed pieces, parts or whatever that they could no longer get. And as a result, the project couldn't move forward. And the banks that were funding this multi-housing project basically ended up telling the developers that they needed to go to conventional construction, or they weren't going to give them the money. They needed to go in a more conservative path where there was redundancy, because the thing about offsite construction and modular construction is that it's like building a car, in the sense that you are constructing things with proprietary means and methods, right? It's not like the universal means of conventional construction. And as a result, they ended up having to revert to conventional construction on this project that would have been a really cool building, and Providence's first, offsite constructed building. So that there's so many aspects. I would encourage people to maybe look into this article if they're interested in things like this. Also, the kind of Toyota-ism that has defined lean management over the last, 40 decades. I talk about Toyota-ism a bit, and this concept in Japan from that philosophy of industrialization, which is called muda in Japan, which means waste of production, which is like overproduction, waste of time on hand or waiting, waste of transport, waste of processing, waste of stock on hand, waste of movement, waste of making defective products. There are all these sub-levels to this system of thinking about muda that is sort of like famously defined in the Toyota way of industrialization, why Toyota has led the world in sort of lean car manufacturing. And what's interesting about it is that when you think about these different levels of waste and you think about them in terms of AEC, you can kind of go through them one by one and talk about overproduction and AEC and how it's related to how we over document, time on hand, how we wait so much because our workflows are disconnected in terms of interoperability, perhaps. You can go through the whole list, and I've done that in the article to kind of outline how AEC actually is not very lean. It's not very like, the method of Toyotaism. It's incredibly messy, but its messiness actually kind of helped it during the pandemic because it wasn't lean. It wasn't subject to these single point blockages that existed in other industries.
Wow, so interesting. I dropped all of these articles and comments. Like I promised, I will also do that right after this conversation on LinkedIn. Thank you so much. This was so insightful and from a completely different perspective as well, getting into these topics. I really encourage all the viewers to take a look and also subscribe to Architosh. I dropped already here the link to Architosh, but for the audio listeners, where do people find you, Anthony?
They can find me on LinkedIn. We have we have a group page, and then there's a normal page. We're on Instagram now, and we're on Facebook and Twitter, of course. There are links to those places on Architosh as well, so you can find Architosh there. And I encourage people to sign up to our newsletter, Espresso, which is free, which focuses actually on emerging technologies like AI and machine learning and robotics and 3D printing and the whole list of extensive emerging technologies that are impacting AEC at this moment. And that's what that newsletter focuses on. So it's a complement to the website itself. And it is where we put our primary and most important features first. So I would encourage people to sign up for that newsletter.
I love this. Thank you so much. And just to one more time to repeat, it's architosh.com. That's how you find the website. Over there, you can sign up for the newsletter and, of course, find articles and links to social media. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure. And what an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all of this research as well and introducing us to it.
Oh, thank you for the invite. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care. And thank you so much to all the listeners. We'll see you at the next one. Bye.